So we're going to be focusing on routing and model binding today. So that piece where the UI will interact with our API through a RESTful interface. So to begin, let's start breaking down what is actually in the controller. So the controller has a couple of things that we're just going to go over really quickly. First off, you'll see that the controller is actually suffixed with the word controller. So you'll have the name of your controller and then it'll always be suffixed. And on top of that, it's always inheriting from controller base. There's also controller. The difference between controller and controller base is controller gives you access to view support, and controller base is without the view support. Next, you'll notice that there are attribute decorators. So there's going to be route attribute decorator, API controller, and there's one for the action. An action is just a terminology to refer to a method within a controller class. Let's start talking about the API controller. You don't really need to worry too much about this controller. It'll cover a couple basic things that are kind of nice for your API. First is that it ensures the controller is decorated with a router. It will handle model binding for you and automatically return 400. And it'll also do binding source parameter inferences and a bunch of other nice little things. I'll leave in the description below some documentations from Microsoft to kind of further explain what the API controller is. But just in general, you won't really need to worry too much about it when you're just getting started. Let's talk about the actions now. I've actually got a series of attributes here for you guys. So the first one here, you'll see it is a empty route and nothing really specified. So what this will do by default is it will just take the parent routing and then defaultly set it as a get. So if you don't specify any verbs, it will put it as a get for you. The next is if you actually specify it as a verb, but then do not specify the route, it will once again set it as get and then just take the parent. So if you alternatively say have a post here, then this would subsequently be post like this with the parent URL. And the next is just going to be when you actually specify the route and then also specify the verb you want. So you can see the get and the post are very similar. This next way of doing it is actually my preferred way, is to specify the verb and then you can also specify the route all in one go. So you won't need to actually have the route attribute, you just have the route specified in, so it would look like this. And finally, if you want to override the parent route, you can start it with a / and then your route will just change to something simply like this. So you can do it both with the verb specified way or by using the route attribute as well. And if you really don't like naming actions or anything, you can actually just have this as a post, delete all of these, and it will go to API, recipe, and that will be a post. So it will be like that. So I'm just going to clear everything up so we can actually start building out our routes. Next, let's take a look back at our application we actually have. So I'm going to just open the browser. And what we can see here is we're just going to kind of navigate around the website. Usually you'll kind of have to conceptually imagine this in your mind and then build out the APIs accordingly. But we know from this view that we're going to need a get list. So let's add a get list to our controller first. It's going to be public async task. And the type you want to usually return is ApiAttribute. This will let you return the different statuses. So we're going to say get list async. And what I meant by that is when you go return, you can actually return type OK, which is acceptable for ApiAttribute. Now you don't necessarily have to use ApiAttribute. You can actually explicitly return a string back and it will return a 200 with a string value in it. But in terms of consistency, I tend to like doing it this way. And now let's decorate that with our attribute. So we know that this is going to be an HTTP GET because we want to get a list of results, which means that this route will ultimately resolve to API recipe. But we want to think in terms of getting a list. Usually you want to return a paginated list. Let's say you have 100 recipes. You'll definitely not want to actually return all of them. So let's add a model binding to this. And the different types of model binding you are actually allowed to have, I will paste it here, is from query, from route, from form, from header, and from body. So the first one we're going to cover is from query, which we will use to specify the parameters of our get list. So let's say we want to theoretically pass in a pagination value into a query parameter. So usually you'll have a question mark specifying you want a query parameter. And then let's say we want page size. And then let's say we want a page size of 10 values. So for that paginated list of recipes, you'll want to return 10 things. And then you need to tell the API which current page you're on. Let's say we want to add page number as well. And how you'll want to accomplish setting these values into your action is by using from query. So let's actually add that then. So what you'll need to do is in your overload, you'll specify an integer of page size, and then you'll also specify an integer of page number. And all you have to do is decorate each one of these variables with from query. And I'm going to just move it down so it's a little bit more readable. From query. So let's just return the page size and page number to the user so we make sure that it actually is working. So let's say page size plus, and we'll add a space, and then we'll just say the page number. Let's set our startup as our Docker and hit F5 to run the server. So with it running, it opened up a browser. I'm going to go API/recipe. And it will end up here. And because we didn't specify any values, these will be defaulted to 0. And now let's take the values we actually wanted to specify in, add it to the parameter. And now we have our results back. So that's an example of a query parameter. So next, let's actually go back to the site and navigate around some more. So I'm going to open the browser again, and we're going back to the recipe book. So let's take a look at going to the view. So the view and edit should result in the same thing where we need to get the item once. So in here, we get the item once, and in here, we get the item once as well. So if we can see from the route, what will be given to identify this specific recipe will be with the ID associated. And you can tell here that the ID is actually going to be a GUID, which means that when we load the recipe list here, each recipe will have an associated ID, and that will return the route here. And then we're expecting that our API then will be able to use this ID to determine the recipe itself. So let's go back to our controller here and add that. So it's the same thing, public async task and iaction result again. So it's going to be, I'm going to call it get once, just so we have an explicit difference between get and get list. And then it's going to return OK again. And now here we're going to specify HTTP get. But the difference here is that we want to specify the route to be something like this, where we can say API recipe, and we want the client side to actually pass us in that ID. So some kind of recipe ID in this, because this will be a unique URL. So let's say we change this to have recipes, and then we have a singular recipe ID like this. And this will also work as well, but then you kind of then break the rules where you have your controller having the same route then that's passed down to your child, and you'll have to start worrying about whether you pluralize something or not. So the simplest way to kind of get around this is actually following the RESTful API and having a unique route like this for getting once. So how you'll be able to get the route out of this URL is by actually specifying that there is a variable you want to get. In this case, we're calling it recipe ID. And as long as this name matches the parameter we're going to be adding in here, so we know the recipe is going to be a GUID in this case, and we're going to name it recipe ID. So as long as this matches this variable name here, and they have a curly bracket here, then they will automatically do the model binding here as well. Alternatively, you can just set from route to be very explicit. Usually I like to be very explicit in case, someone's jumping around and they're just trying to very quickly assess. At least they'll be able to see that this is from route and this is from query. So once again, I'm just going to take the value, pass it in here, and then have that return to the user. And what we're going to do is just kick off the server and then see if we can get the value in. So in our browser, once again, we're just going to take this GUID, and now we're going to match the URL. So API recipe and then that recipe ID. So we're going to press enter and it should return to us the GUID we passed in. Let's take a look at the next API we'll need. So back to our recipe list, we can see that there is a new recipe. So we're going to need an ability to add a new recipe. So this will be a post, which is usually used to create a new value of some kind. So let's add that. So back in our controller, let's stop the debugger and add public async task. Once again, action result, and we're going to say post async. Obviously, you can name your methods add new recipe or however you would like. So let's go HTTP post as the method. So now we need to conceptually think about the data that's going to be passed to us. So since we're doing a post, we can either get the value either one of two ways, either from the form or from the body. In our case, we're going to get the value from the body, and I'm going to say from body. And now we need to actually pass in an object. So we have a recipe entity that we have created earlier, and I'm just going to say that is a recipe. Now we're going to do the same thing what we did earlier is we returned the recipe back to the user. And by default, ASP.NET Core will be expecting JSON and returning JSON. So let's start our application, and then we'll be trying to attempt to make a post request here and seeing if we can get that same result returned to us. So I'm going to be using something called Postman, which lets us perform HTTP requests. I'm going to add a new request. I'm going to paste in the URL. So this was the URL we're expecting, and we're going to change the verb from get to post. And I'm also going to go to headers, add in content type, because ASP.NET Core expects the content to be passed in as JSON by default. And I'm going to say application JSON is the content type. And next, we're going to go to body. So remember what I said, we can either pass in a form or we can pass in as the body. So to pass in as the body, you click raw. And here we're going to be passing in the recipe object, which includes only title. And we're just going to say, I guess, fried chicken, since we had fried chicken earlier. You can click beautify if you want to format it. And we're just going to send that request. And we should get back exactly the same result, which we did here. Perfect. So we're getting pretty close to having all of our APIs that we need. So let's go back to our recipe book and take a look at what else we need to do. So we have our add here. Go back to the list view. We'll go to edit. And now we'll need to save the edit. And we'll also need to be able to delete. So it looks like on this page, on the edit page itself, it does a get. And then on save, we'll need to do something different than the actual creation, because we'll have the existing data and then we need to actually mutate that data. And then we'll have to have a delete as well. Let's go add our update. So same idea, stop the debugger, public async task action result. I'm going to call it put async. So there's also patch as well that you can use, but most of the time I would say use put instead of patch, just because you don't want to spend time arguing about which is the right HTTP verb. You just want to pick the one and be productive with the one that you're going to pick. So same idea from body, because we know that when we hit save, it's going to be the same idea as the add, where we're going to be passed a JSON body of the things to update this time. So recipe entity and recipe. And let's add our verb, HTTP put. Just so you guys can see HTTP patch, it's also here as well. So we're going to do put. So return OK, and then recipe. All right. And then let's add our delete. So public async task I action result and delete async. But the delete, we're going to be deleting with a given ID. So we know that on the edit page, they're going to have the recipe ID, and then they can use that recipe ID to say, delete this recipe from my records. So we're going to say HTTP delete. And like we did earlier with the get once, we're going to pass in a ID from the route. So we're going to say recipe ID. And we're going to say it's a GUID again, and it's going to be recipe ID. So that's going to return OK. And we're going to return that recipe ID back to the user. So let's test out our new endpoints. So I'm going to start the application, and I'm going to open Postman. So now we are going to change our verb from post to put, just to make sure that that's not returning a 404. So let's test that. And it looks like that's working. And now let's test our delete. So going here, and now we have to get a GUID. So I'm going to go back to this page here. I'm going to grab this and open Postman again, and I'm going to pass this in. So this should, well, we no longer need the body, because it won't even care if there is a body, but let's hit send. And, oh, sorry, we have deleted recipe. So now let's click send. And we got a 200 with a GUID back. So in this tutorial, we were able to create a bunch of RESTful endpoints. We went through routing and a little bit of model binding. In the next one, we're actually going to start being able to save things to the database and kind of start structuring our code so that we're able to actually perform some actions. So as always, make sure you subscribe to the channel, like this video, and I will see you guys next time.